Alright, so how did Great Britain react to the situation after Napoleon? So obviously Napoleon had conducted war throughout Europe, and Great Britain certainly was a big part of that, certainly through its navy and then finally its army taking place in Portugal, but also around Belgium in his final defeat. But throughout the entirety of the war, Britain was relatively unaffected. Their economic systems were in place. You had the start, certainly, of the Industrial Revolution. Manufacturing as well as food production was relatively secure, and with its massive fleet and its navy, they could protect its sea lanes. So they could continue trading with their colonies, as well as other partners around the world, certainly Russia, which was certainly against Napoleon at the time. And so their economy was relatively unaffected. Standard of living was certainly not as it was. They did have to ration and make sure that they had the resources available, but everyone was certainly capable and able to get enough food and conduct business as life was before the war. Now, certainly Great Britain did get involved in the War of 1812 with the United States, and it was able to conduct that war as well, relatively unaffected. So Great Britain was in a very good spot, and certainly its navy, as well as some of the new ideas with finances, farming, and technology, helped Great Britain out immensely by doing so. Now, after the war, um, essentially the rest of Europe was buying into the ideas of the revolution, the American as well as the French Revolution, and certainly Napoleon White ideas was spread through his conquests. Much of those ideas were not in place in Europe outside of Great Britain. Great Britain, on the other hand, did have many of those liberal ideas. And so they really didn't have the revolutionary spirit that many of the other European countries were experiencing. For example, Great Britain had free press. They had a Bill of Rights. Many of the countries in Europe did not have that. And so these concerns really didn't affect Great Britain much at all because they already had much of these ideas in place and protected by laws. So what happened in Great Britain was actually an era of reform rather than revolution. Revolution was not going to occur in Great Britain at this time, unlike the rest of Europe. Instead, what many of the politicians of the day were attempting to reform essentially what was already in place. So, some of these reform methods can be based in three different ideas. The first one is going to essentially repeal the denial of political power to Catholics. Because at this time in England, the Protestants had political power. What was in place was that the Catholics and those who did not attend the Anglican Church in England could not hold political office. So they could not belong to the House of Lords or House of Commons. And this comes out of the era that we talked about previously, prior to certainly the William Orange and certainly after Queen Elizabeth. Many people were fearful of a Catholic uprising. But at this period of time, the religious wars and that sentiment had faded. And so this law seemed a bit antiquated for England at this time. And so many politicians started to attempt legislation to repeal. So Catholics and those who do not attend the Anglican Church could actually be involved in the political process. And this was a relatively smooth transition. The wars of Napoleon ended in 1815, and by 1828, this repeal actually got passed relatively quickly. The first objective was, and reform was going to be accomplished fairly succinctly. The second one, reform, was to expand male as well as female suffrage. Essentially, in England, how people got the right to vote was very much like everywhere else in the world, at least in the Western world, the United States as well as France, and certainly England. If you wanted the right to vote or to be in the political process, you had to own property. Now, how much property was what really divided who actually was able to vote. In the United States, for example, there was a very limited amount of property, so a lot of people could actually vote in that process. While in France, under Charles X, it only really limited the very wealthy. Now, in England, they wanted to reduce the property to allow more and more individuals to actually have the right to vote and be involved in the political process. And so they reduced those limitations in 1832 so that the middle class could actually be involved in the political process. However, as far as male suffrage as well as female suffrage, many advocates wanted all men, and then of course all women, to have the right to vote and be involved in the political process. That stage is not going to occur for quite some time. Certainly women are not going to get the right to vote until 1916, and wholesale ability for men to vote no matter their property is going to have to wait in the next 20 to 30 years. So they are going to continue to fight in Parliament to get this passed, but it's going to be a long time coming. The third reform that is going to occur in England is going to be on the object of free trade. What free trade is the fact that you are going to be able to trade with anybody in the world. So if you're an Englishman, you could trade with the French, the Germans, the United States, the Chinese, the Japanese, so on and so forth. But the difference is that there would not be any tariffs to restrict trade. Many countries applied tariffs on foreign goods, so it would be more expensive to buy grains from other countries. So that's going to restrict trade, and in fact also annoy some other countries in the fact that they might not even try to sell you grain because they know they're not going to get a profit. That was sort of the problem that was happening in the 1820s and certainly 1830s. And so there were advocates, certainly in the middle class and industrialists, that wanted these tariffs removed, especially on grains and other raw materials. With the Industrial Revolution, they needed iron, they needed coal. These raw materials had tariffs applied to them. And so through a long process of negotiating with politicians, as well as merchants and others, these tariffs are finally going to be removed in 1845. And so now, by 1845, you're going to see these raw materials passing through into England fairly fluidly, and there's going to be quite a bit of supplies. What that's going to allow is farmers can now plant crops easily. They can also use that iron, that coal, and other raw resources, produce goods, and then those produced goods will be sold on the open market in England, but also around the world. What this does is it massively increases the economic wealth of England across the board. Farmers, industrialists, factory workers, and that wealth is going to be also distributed throughout the society as well. So this helps out massively. What this also does is the English, with their farming techniques and now with a massive amount of grain coming into England, they do not have to fear starvation. And that's going to be something very integral in the late 1840s, which we'll talk about in a later video. Now, why did England not revolt? Well, part of this, as I mentioned earlier, was because they had a lot of the freedoms that the Continentals really wanted. But also what England did after the war was they reduced taxes, in part because they didn't need those massive taxes because they were at peace. They did not need the money for constructing ships and armies and weapons and so on and so forth. So the reduction in taxes really pacified any sort of sentiments of revolution. The English also had a very effective police force. They are going to be the forerunners of much of the law enforcement of the day, and many people are going to borrow these methods. Certainly, the United States is going to borrow the methods for law enforcement, as well as the French. And so these methods are going to certainly reduce any sort of sentiment of revolution. Now, as far as the reforms for workers, the Industrial Revolution certainly didn't help workers' safety. There were a lot of problems with machines and limbs getting caught in the machines, as well as dangerous work to get these resources, manufacture, process these resources. So people worked 12-hour days. They didn't have any benefits. They were very tired. They weren't paid very much. And of course, the work being very dangerous. This was the next front which liberals were going to try to reform. Unfortunately, this treatment and these reforms are not going to happen for another 20 years. So this is another reform program that is going to take a very long time to actually get done. And as more and more countries get industrialized, this is going to come to a forefront of many of their reform movements as well. But we'll talk about when that actually happened in another video. So it's a very quick overview of what kind of reforms and changes actually happened with England after the Napoleonic Wars.